On a Tuesday morning in late August of 1911, when the Louvre was still more workshop than shrine, Louis Beroux walked with the unhurried purpose of a man who had come to earn his bread by copying greatness. He carried his paints and brushes through galleries that smelled faintly of stone dust and varnish, nodded to guards who were accustomed to seeing easels planted before the old masters, and turned into the Salon Carré, where Leonardo's small portrait hung among larger, louder glories. The place where the picture should have been was not empty in the way of a wall that has never borne anything. It was marked, 4 iron pegs, a pale rectangle, the precise absence of a presence. Beroux paused, then looked again, as if his eyes had betrayed him. He asked a guard what had become of it. The guard, still living in the ordinary logic of museum routine, answered that it must have been taken down to be photographed. Minutes lengthened into an hour. The easels of other copyists stood like question marks. At last, someone went to inquire, and then another. The quiet machinery of a great institution began to grind backward. The doors were watched, the corridors searched, the administrators summoned, the police called. A painting that had sat for years in the public gaze had, in the most literal sense, vanished from the world. The episode is usually told as a theft, and so it was, but it deserves remembrance as an education. It taught the modern age, already intoxicated with newspapers, crowds, and the new rapidity of fame, how celebrity can be made, not merely found. For centuries, a work of art had been esteemed by a slow consensus of artists, patrons, and connoisseurs. Now a painting could become universal by a different path, through scandal, repetition, and the appetite of the public for a story. The Mona Lisa did not become famous because she was stolen. She became globally famous because the theft provided the world with a plot in which the portrait could play the leading role. In the early 20th century, when the machinery of mass attention was still young enough to be amazed at itself, the disappearance of a modest panel of wood drew into its orbit nationalism, modern policing, museum pride, and the churning imagination of the press. It was, in miniature, the birth of the celebrity economy, an economy that traffics less in intrinsic merit than in visibility, talk, and the feeling that everyone, everywhere, is looking at the same thing. To understand what was manufactured in 1911, one must recall what the Louvre then was. It was already a magnificent storehouse, an imperial anthology of seized or purchased beauty, but it was not yet the carefully defended fortress of glass and alarms that later generations take for granted. The museum's routines retained something of the 19th century habit. It was a public institution that assumed the decency of the public. The guards were numerous, but not always vigilant. The galleries were open to copyists, students, tourists, and idlers who wandered with canes and hats. The Louvre itself was a symbol in a nation that had made symbols a second religion. After the Revolution, after Napoleon's campaigns, after the upheavals of 1830 and 1848, after the humiliation of 1871, France had learned to house its pride not only in armies and flags, but in culture, in the idea that Paris was the capital of civilization. The museum was a civic cathedral, secular, rational, yet demanding reverence. It proclaimed that the state could preserve what private hands might squander, and it hinted that France, through taste and guardianship, had inherited the treasures of Europe. In that long hall of implied superiority, Leonardo's portrait was not yet the monarch it would become. Connoisseurs admired it, painters especially, who recognized in the soft transitions of its shadows a technical miracle, and in the ambiguous smile a psychological depth that seemed to anticipate modern sensibility. But the Louvre offered many rivals for the visitor's attention: the grand canvases of history, the monumental sculptures, the great theatrical gestures of other schools. The Mona Lisa was small, quiet, and subtle. She did not shout across the room. Her name, La Joconde, was known in France, and reproductions existed, as they existed for many notable works, but the painting had not yet hardened into the single emblem it later became. The world had not agreed to treat this woman's face as shorthand for art itself. That agreement would be negotiated, not by academies, but by headlines. The portrait's earlier journey had already intertwined art with power. Leonardo began it in Florence, likely in the first years of the 16th century, perhaps for a merchant's household, perhaps as an experiment never quite relinquished. Like many of Leonardo's works, it seems to have remained with him rather than with a patron, and thus it traveled as he traveled, an intimate possession of the artist. When he accepted the invitation of Francis I and crossed into France, he carried with him not only notebooks and dreams, but this panel, still alive with his attention. At some point it entered the royal collection. It hung at Fontainebleau, later at Versailles, later found its way through the storms of monarchy and republic into the National Museum. By then, its value was not merely aesthetic, it was political. A painting that had crossed borders with an artist could be claimed by a nation with a bureaucracy. Such claims are often lawful, but they are rarely innocent. They awaken the ancient human impulse to treat beauty as trophy and possession as proof. Meanwhile, the modern press was learning to be more than a chronicler. It was becoming a manufacturer of public reality. Newspapers had grown cheap and ubiquitous. Their circulation reached into villages, cafes, railway stations. Photography, still imperfect but potent, gave the public the feeling of seeing with its own eyes. The century had already witnessed the rise of public personalities who existed almost entirely through print. Politicians, adventurers, performers, criminals. In earlier epochs, a thief might become a folk tale. Now, he could become a daily serial. The public's curiosity had been trained by urban life to feed on novelty. The newspaper did not merely report events. It selected, framed, repeated, and amplified them until they became common property. In such an environment, the disappearance of a famous object was not only a crime, it was a narrative vacuum into which imagination would rush. The man who provided the world with this vacuum was not a romantic master of disguise, but a small, hard-working immigrant named Vincenzo Perugia. His biography, like many that history suddenly illuminates, was ordinary until it became notorious. Born in Italy, he came to France, as many Italians did, to seek work in the great capital that both attracted and resented them. He found employment connected with the Louvre, variously described in the records as a handyman or glazier, work that brought him near the paintings and acquainted him with the museum's rhythms. He was not the only foreign laborer in Paris. The city's grandeur depended on such hands. But in times of tension, the foreigner becomes a convenient vessel for suspicion or for patriotic fantasy. On Monday, August 21st, 1911, the Louvre's closing day, when its public rooms were quieter and its corridors belonged more to staff than to crowds, Perugia entered the museum wearing the sort of white smock that made a man look like an employee rather than an intruder. The detail matters because it reveals how much institutions rely on the habits of recognition. We trust uniforms, we trust routine, we trust what seems to belong. He went to the Salon Carré, lifted the portrait from its place, and withdrew with it into a stairwell or service area where he could work unseen for minutes that, in retrospect, seem impossibly generous. There he removed the panel from its frame. The frame, ornate, cumbersome, useless for concealment, was left behind and later found. The painting itself, light enough to carry beneath a garment, became portable. At some point, Perugia reached an exit. A story lingers that a door handle or latch gave him trouble and that he received help from an unwitting worker. Such anecdotes, whether precisely true or embroidered by retelling, capture the essential fact. The theft succeeded less through genius than through the museum's assumption that nothing like this would happen. It is easy, with the security habits of later generations, to treat this as farce. But the farce had consequences, and it was precisely its simplicity that frightened Paris. The world likes to believe that great things are protected by great precautions. When a masterpiece slips away as if it were a coat in a cafe, the public feels not merely anger, but humiliation. The Louvre represented France's cultural sovereignty. The ease of the theft suggested that sovereignty could be mocked by a single man with a smock. Pride was wounded, and wounded pride searches for culprits. The museum did not discover its loss in the immediate hour of the crime. Works were sometimes taken down for cleaning or photography. The bureaucratic life of a great collection includes temporary absences that mean nothing. Only when Béroux and others insisted on the painting's return did the absence become suspicious. Then suspicion hardened into panic. The Louvre closed its doors. Rooms were searched as if a painting could hide behind a curtain. Guards were questioned. Administrators reprimanded. The police arrived with the solemnity that modern states bring to threats against their symbolic property. In a city that had endured political violence and public scandal, the theft of a painting might seem minor. Yet the public response proved that nations will weep for symbols with a passion they rarely spend on abstract principles. The investigation bore the stamp of a new age. French policing had been modernizing, with an increasing faith in scientific methods and record-keeping. Fingerprinting, still young as a tool, offered the alluring promise that the body itself could betray the criminal. The investigators dusted for prints on the frame and the glass of the case or protective covering in which the portrait had been housed. They found a fingerprint, an intimate trace, a small signature left by skin, but they could not match it to a known suspect, for the thief had not yet earned a place in the police archives. This is one of history's quiet ironies. The crime occurred at the border between the old world, where guilt was pursued by witnesses and confessions, and the new world, where guilt would be pursued by databases. The machinery was in motion, but its memory was incomplete. Meanwhile, the press began its own investigation, which was at once more chaotic and more powerful. The newspapers demanded details, and where details were absent, they supplied conjecture. They described the empty space on the wall, photographed it, printed it, and thus turned absence into an image. They interviewed guards, copyists, and officials. They published rumors about foreign collectors, German agents, secret societies. The theft became a mirror into which each faction could project its fears. In the years before the Great War, Europe's nations watched one another with the nervousness of armed neighbors. France, still smarting from the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, saw in German power a constant menace. It was natural, almost inevitable, that some would imagine a German hand behind the theft, as if a painting could be enlisted in geopolitical rivalry. Nationalism, which feeds on symbols, found a fresh morsel. The museum itself became a stage. People gathered not merely to see art, but to see the place where art had been stolen. The Louvre, closed to protect what remained, became more alluring. There is in the human mind a perverse equation. What is forbidden must be valuable. What is missing must be important. The crowds pressed toward the building as if the absence itself were an exhibit. In cafes and on street corners, the public debated possibilities with the confidence of spectators. Paris, the city that had made spectacle into an art, now watched itself watching a crime. It was in this atmosphere that the investigation widened into one of those episodes where cultural conflict and police work intertwine. The police, under pressure to produce a suspect, looked for those already marked as suspicious by public opinion. The avant-garde, always a favorite target of bourgeois anxiety, offered a convenient scapegoat. A minor scandal had recently touched the Louvre. A man named Géry Pierret, associated with the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, had stolen small Iberian sculptures from the museum and sold them. When the Mona Lisa vanished, this earlier theft resurfaced like a buried infection. Apollinaire, A foreign-born poet with a taste for provocation became vulnerable. He was arrested and questioned. In fear, or in the melodramatic spirit of the time, he implicated Pablo Picasso, who had purchased one of the stolen statues. Picasso, already notorious for his assaults on traditional form, was brought in for questioning as well. The spectacle of these artists, whose work many already disliked or did not understand, being treated as potential thieves of a Renaissance masterpiece, reveals how the public mind organizes its dislikes. The Mona Lisa, by her very nature as a gentle classical image, stood for tradition, for continuity, for the reassuring idea that beauty had rules. The modern artists stood, in the caricature of their critics, for disruption and irreverence. To imagine them stealing the portrait was to enact a moral drama, the barbarians at the gate of civilization. The fact that the suspicion was unfounded did not diminish its usefulness. It allowed newspapers to print names that sold papers, and it allowed readers to feel that they understood the crime. It was the work of those strange moderns, those foreigners, those men who did not respect what we respect. In the end, the questioning of Apollinaire and Picasso produced embarrassment rather than resolution. The artists were released, the case returned to uncertainty. But the episode had already performed its cultural work. It attached the painting to the age's broader anxieties, about foreigners, about modernity, about the fragility of inherited greatness. In so doing, it made the portrait more than a work of art. It made it a character in a public drama, and characters, not objects, are what the modern public truly remembers. As days passed without an arrest, the press filled the vacuum with invention. The painting's image, already reproducible, became ubiquitous. One might have thought that the disappearance of the original would reduce public access to it. Instead, it multiplied its appearances. Newspapers printed photographs of the painting, of the gallery, of suspected thieves, of police officials. Postcards circulated. The portrait's face, separated now from the physical panel and carried by paper, became more public than ever. It is one of the fundamental paradoxes of modern fame. The original object matters less and less as reproduction becomes more and more pervasive. The theft hastened this shift. The Mona Lisa was no longer simply a painting in a museum. She was an image in the world. In that transformation, we can see the early outlines of celebrity culture as we now know it. Celebrity depends on three things: a subject, a story, and a medium that can repeat both without exhaustion. The subject may be mediocre. The story may be trivial. The medium supplies the rest by endless circulation. The Mona Lisa had the first element in abundance, a subject whose face seemed to invite interpretation. But she lacked, for the general public, the second element, a story that made her feel urgent. The theft provided it. Suddenly, she was not merely admired, she was missing. She became a mystery, and mysteries provoke participation. Every reader could become a detective, every café conversation a tribunal. The press, which lives by participation, fed the appetite with daily morsels. Thus, a painting painted 4 centuries earlier entered the nervous system of a modern mass public. To call this manufacturing is not to deny Leonardo's genius. It is to observe that genius alone does not determine a work's place in popular consciousness. Many masterpieces remain the private wealth of the educated. Many mediocre works become famous because they are attached to the right anecdote. In the case of the Mona Lisa, the theft did not create value, but it created attention, and attention is the currency of modern culture. The public learned to treat the painting's fame as self-evident precisely because everyone was talking about it. When an object becomes the topic of universal conversation, its importance feels natural, almost inevitable, but it is often the result of accidental events amplified by media. The French state felt in the months after the theft the sting of ridicule. Abroad, newspapers mocked the Louvre's security. At home, political opponents used the scandal to criticize officials. The museum's administrators became symbols of bureaucratic incompetence. In such times, an institution's primary concern becomes not the recovery of the object, difficult and uncertain, but the recovery of dignity. The state sought to show energy. Searches were conducted, border controls tightened, rewards offered. But the public wanted more than action. It wanted reassurance that France remained the guardian of civilization. The theft, though materially minor compared to the nation's larger troubles, touched a sensitive nerve, the belief that cultural supremacy could compensate for political vulnerability. Italy, watching from across the Alps, experienced a different emotion, a mixture of resentment and desire. The story that would later be told, that Perugia stole the painting out of patriotic conviction to return it to Italy, found ready soil in an Italy still hungry for symbols of its own greatness. The 19th century had united Italy politically, but unity had not erased regional poverty nor produced immediate international respect. The memory of the Renaissance, like a half-remembered glory, could be invoked to comfort the present. Many Italians, hearing that a Leonardo portrait sat in the Louvre, felt that something of Italy's soul was held abroad. They were not unique in this. Nations everywhere develop proprietary feelings about the art produced within their historical borders, even when those borders did not exist at the time. Such feelings are not legal arguments, but they are potent emotions, and politics often runs on emotions more than on logic. The truth about Perugia's motives, like the truth about many crimes, likely lies in a blend rather than a single pure cause. He was an immigrant laborer in a city that could be both generous and contemptuous. He may have absorbed the common Italian grievance that French museums were filled with Italian art, some of it taken by Napoleon's armies. He may have felt the sting of being treated as a foreigner in the capital of culture, and he almost certainly understood that the painting, if sold, could bring money he would never earn through wages. Patriotism and profit are not always enemies. They often cooperate within the same human heart, each giving the other a respectable mask. For more than 2 years the painting remained hidden while the world imagined elaborate conspiracies. The simplest explanation, that a single man had carried it away and concealed it nearby, was hardest for the public to accept because it insulted their sense of scale. We prefer to believe that great events have great causes. A masterpiece, we think, must be stolen by a master thief, aided by a network, pursued across borders by daring detectives. Such beliefs flatter our taste for drama. They also protect us from the humiliating thought that our institutions, however grand, can be undone by ordinary negligence and ordinary audacity. During those years, the Mona Lisa's absence continued to generate presence. Her reproduction grew. Her name became a phrase known even to those who could not have distinguished Leonardo from Raphael. She entered jokes, songs, and caricatures. One might say that she became for the first time a public personality. The press spoke of her as she, not it, a linguistic shift that mattered. Objects become celebrities when we anthropomorphize them, when we treat them as if they had intentions and emotions. The Mona Lisa's smile, already ambiguous, now seemed to carry a new meaning, the smile of someone who had escaped. The portrait's psychological mystique was retroactively enhanced by the drama imposed upon it. The theft did not merely publicize the painting, it altered the way people saw it. Art, which seems to exist outside of time, is constantly rewritten by time. Then, in late 1913, the story took a turn that confirmed the old lesson that reality often resolves mysteries without elegance. Perugia, having kept the painting for years, hidden, reportedly, in a trunk or a modest hiding place, decided to profit from his possession. He returned to Italy and contacted an art dealer in Florence, Alfredo Geri, offering to sell a Leonardo that he claimed to have. Geri, suspicious yet intrigued, arranged a meeting. Perugia brought the panel to a hotel room. There, in the prosaic setting of rented furniture and ordinary light, the most famous missing object in Europe emerged from concealment. Geri and the director of the Uffizi, Giovanni Poggi, examined it and recognized what the world had been seeking. They did what modern institutions do when confronted with temptation. They delayed, they pretended cooperation, and they called the authorities. Perugia was arrested. Italy greeted the recovery with jubilation that had little to do with the facts of ownership and much to do with national feeling. Newspapers portrayed Perugia as a patriot, a son of Italy who had outwitted France. The painting was displayed in Italian cities, Florence, Rome, perhaps Milan, drawing crowds who came to see not only Leonardo's art, but Italy's returned glory. The episode revealed again the strange economy of symbols. The painting's value was measured not only in aesthetic terms, but in the pride it could produce. The Italian tour, though brief, functioned as a national festival. It also placed governments in a delicate position. France, insulted yet cautious, demanded the painting's return. Italy, pleased but aware of diplomatic realities, negotiated. The law, in this case, was clear enough. The Louvre was its lawful custodian. Yet law was less important to the public than the emotional story of possession and recovery. When the painting finally returned to Paris in January 1914, it entered the Louvre not as a work among works, but as a triumphant celebrity returning from exile. Crowds came in numbers the museum had rarely seen. People who might never have made the pilgrimage to view Leonardo's subtle portrait now came because they had followed her life in newspapers for 2 years. The museum's humiliation was transformed into a kind of victory. It had lost the painting and regained it, and in the process it had acquired something else: global attention. The Louvre became not merely a repository, but a protagonist. It learned, as institutions learn, that scandal can be converted into prestige if one survives it. Perugia's trial provided the final act in the public drama. The court heard his explanations, weighed his motives, and sentenced him, though with a leniency that reflected, in part, the sympathy his patriotic claim aroused in Italy. He served a relatively short term. The public, having consumed the story, moved on to new spectacles. Europe itself was about to plunge into a far greater catastrophe, and the theft of a painting would seem, in the shadow of war, like a quaint mischief of a more innocent age. Yet the cultural consequences remained. The Mona Lisa had been transformed. She had become, by the alchemy of media, the most famous painting in the world. In the years that followed, museums hardened their defenses. Security improved, protocols tightened, the idea that masterpieces might be targets became an accepted truth. But the deeper lesson was not about locks. It was about attention. The public had demonstrated that it could be made to care intensely about a work of art, not by slow education, not by the cultivation of taste, but by narrative shock. A theft reported daily, could create a global consensus of importance more quickly than centuries of connoisseurship. The painting's fame became self-perpetuating. Because it was famous, it was reproduced. Because it was reproduced, it became more famous. The media machine that had helped to create her celebrity would continue to feed it long after the original scandal faded. One might ask, with a certain melancholy, what this says about our relation to beauty. Do we love the painting for what it is, or for what it represents in the public imagination? The question is not confined to art. Modern celebrity culture, in its many forms, often detaches the celebrated subject from its intrinsic qualities and attaches it instead to a story the public can share. We do not merely admire, we participate. We feel that we have a relationship to a face because we have seen it repeated, discussed, joked about, and absorbed into the common language of our time. The Mona Lisa became such a face. Her smile, once a private enigma between painter and sitter, became a public commodity, interpreted endlessly, printed on every kind of object, invoked in advertisements, parodied in cartoons. The theft was the catalyst that pushed her from the realm of art history into the realm of mass culture. Nationalism played its part in this manufacture. The painting became an emblem in the rivalry of nations, a token in the competition for cultural prestige. France's possession of the portrait was not merely custodianship, it was proof of being the museum of the world. Italy's desire for it was not merely sentiment, it was a claim to a Renaissance inheritance. The public on each side treated the painting as if it were a living hostage. In doing so, they revealed how modern nationalism appropriates art. It turns the universal into the particular, the human into the national. A Renaissance portrait painted in a city-state that did not yet dream of a unified Italy became, in 1911, a symbol of Italy, and a royal possession acquired by France centuries earlier became, in 1911, a symbol of the French Republic. Art, which might have served as a bridge, became a boundary marker. Museums, too, were implicated. They had been created in part to democratize access to what had once been the privilege of courts and churches. But in gathering treasures under state control, they also created new forms of possession and new anxieties about loss. A museum is, at its best, a school. At its worst, it can become a vault whose contents confer prestige. The theft of the Mona Lisa dramatized this tension. It showed that the museum's public mission, open doors, accessible galleries, was in conflict with the need to guard what it held. The solution, in the long run, would be to fortify the museum, to place glass and distance between public and masterpiece. The democratic dream would be preserved, but mediated. The public would see, but through barriers. The theft thus contributed, indirectly, to the transformation of the museum from a place of intimate encounter into a place of controlled spectacle. And the media, perhaps the most important actor of all, revealed its power to define what the world considers important. Newspapers did not invent the painting's artistic merit, but they invented the painting's public centrality. They did so by turning the theft into a serial story and the painting into a character. They repeated her image until it became familiar. They repeated her name until it became inevitable. Familiarity, in the modern world, is often mistaken for greatness. When something is everywhere, we assume it must deserve to be. In this way, the press did what it often does. It created a consensus not by argument, but by saturation. One must not exaggerate the novelty of this phenomenon. Even in ancient times, public fame could be manufactured by rumor, gossip, and political theater. But what changed in the early 20th century was scale and speed. The Mona Lisa's disappearance was known across borders within days. The story traveled as fast as trains carried newspapers. The same images appeared in different languages. The public, in multiple countries, consumed the same narrative and thus shared a synchronized attention. This synchronization is the essence of modern celebrity, the sense that millions of strangers are thinking about the same face at the same moment. The theft created such a moment and demonstrated how easily it could be achieved. There is a final irony worth noting. The Mona Lisa, as an artwork, invites quiet contemplation. It is not grand, it does not overwhelm. It suggests that the deepest effects are achieved not by force, but by subtlety. Yet her modern fame arose not from contemplation, but from noise. The world did not become obsessed with her because it sat in silence before her sfumato. It became obsessed because it could not stop talking about her disappearance. The painting's nature and its celebrity seem almost opposite. Perhaps this is the fate of many quiet things in a loud age. To be heard, they must be caught in a shout. Still, it would be unfair to say that the theft reduced the painting to mere publicity. The scandal brought countless people to the Louvre who might otherwise have remained indifferent to art. Some came out of curiosity and left with a new respect for the fragile survival of beauty. Some came to see a celebrity and discovered unexpectedly the calm power of the original. If the modern world sometimes needs drama to approach depth, that is a weakness, but it can also be, in strange ways, an avenue. The theft made the painting a doorway. The public entered through the door of scandal. A few may have lingered in the room of art. In our own time, when attention is mined with a sophistication that would have astonished the editors of 1911, the episode reads like a first experiment in a vast industry. Today, we watch fame manufactured daily. A face goes viral, a story is amplified, a scandal is monetized, a persona is built from fragments. The pattern is familiar because it was already visible in the Mona Lisa affair. The ingredients were present: a subject capable of fascination, an event that made the subject urgent, and a media system hungry to repeat. What was new was the recognition, half conscious, half instinctive, that the public could be led to treat an object as if it were a living star. So the day the Mona Lisa vanished is remembered not merely as a crime against a museum, but as a turning point in the history of perception. A small painting, once the quiet property of connoisseurs, became the world's most recognized image because it was absent, and because the modern world cannot tolerate absence without making it a story. The Louvre learned that its treasures were not safe simply because they were revered. The public learned that it could be made to care by a narrative. Nations learned again that art can inflame pride. And the media learned, with a lesson it would never forget, that by choosing what to repeat, it could decide what the world would love.